welcome to our first Bible study of the new year. To get started, let's just think a little bit. Think about 2024, the year that just passed. Think about some of the highs that you had during the year, some of the good times. No year comes or goes without some difficult times, some low times. Some years, of course, are better than others, but think about some of the lows, perhaps, that you had during 2025 or 2024. And then most years have surprises, and a lot of times surprises come after the lows. We have a low time, a difficult time, and then we find God somehow finds a way to redeem that low time or bring something good out of it, even if it's not something that would be for the absolute best, something good as well. Every year has highs and lows and surprises, if we're willing to look for them. Every life particularly does. And when you look back over your life, you can immediately come up with some of the highest points in your life and some of the lowest points in your life. And likely, if you think about it, you can also come up with some times when coming out of a low time, God really surprised you, maybe with something good or with some lesson or with some blessing. That's exactly what the Psalms do. The Psalms prepare us for life, and the Psalms give us language. The Psalms, of course, are prayers. And they give us prayer language for the times when things are great. And they give us prayer language for the times when things are not great. And they give us prayer language for times when God has brought us out of difficult times as well. Walter Brueggemann, just an amazing Old Testament scholar, has come up really with a matrix. And he says that most Psalms fit into one of these three categories. He calls them Psalms of orientation. And that's when everything is going right. And life just works. And we know that happens. A classic psalm of orientation is the very first psalm in the book. Blessed are those who do not walk in the way with the wicked, or stand in the way that the sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but who delight in the law of the Lord, and meditate on his law day and night. They are like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. Not so the wicked. They are like chaff, and the wind blows away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will be destroyed. And we see that happen sometimes. Those who are good and righteous are able to succeed and triumph over those who are wicked. And we see that we're rewarded for the times that we offer integrity to the world and joy to the world and the good things of the world. And those who offer the opposite are punished. But of course, we know that doesn't always happen. But sometimes God does, as I mentioned before, bring us through the difficult times. And we see that in the Psalms as well. Let me share with you Psalm 18. I'm going to read verse 6 and then verse 16 through 17. So in verse 6, the psalmist says, "In my distress I called to the Lord. I cried to my God for help. From his temple he heard my voice. My cry came before him and into his ears." And then skipping down a few verses, we find out what happened. "He reached down from on high and took hold of me. He drew me out of deep waters. He rescued me from my powerful enemy, from my foes who were too strong for me." And so we see there this story. I was in a terrible time, and yet God came and rescued me, and God came and made everything different. And we probably know of those times as well. But it's also the case, and I'm oddly thankful that it is the case, that the psalmists give us language for when everything falls apart and times are not good anymore, and even the prospect for good times seems so far off. And today's psalm is one of them. When nothing makes sense, when it seems like the world has turned upside down, and it seems like maybe God is even absent. So our psalm for today is the 10th psalm, and I'll share the entire psalm with you because that's in our lesson. "Why, Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? In their arrogance, the wicked hunt down the weak, catching them in the schemes they devise. They boast about the cravings of their hearts. They bless the greedy and revile the Lord. In their pride, the wicked do not seek him. In all their thoughts, there is no room for God. Their ways are always prosperous. Your laws are rejected by them, and they sneer at all their enemies. They say to themselves, nothing will ever shake us. They swear, no one will ever do us harm. Their mouths are full of lies and threats. Trouble and evil are under their tongues. They lie in wait near the villages. From ambush they murder the innocent. Their eyes watch in secret for their victims like a lion in cover. They lie in wait. They lie in wait to catch the helpless. They catch the helpless and drag them off in their nets. The innocent are crushed. They collapse. They fall victim to superior strength. And the wicked say to themselves, God will never notice. He covers his face and he never sees. Arise, Lord. Lift up your hand, O God. Do not forget the helpless. Why do the wicked revile God? Why do they say to themselves, he won't call us to account? But you, God, you see the trouble of the afflicted. You consider their grief and take it in your hand. The victims commit themselves to you. You are the Father of the helpless. Break the arms. Okay, I lost my place. Break the arms of the wicked and the evildoers. Call them to account for their wickedness. They would not otherwise, that would not otherwise be found out. The Lord is king forever and ever. The nations will perish from this land. You, O Lord, hear the desire of the afflicted. You encourage them and you listen to their cry, defending the fatherless and the oppressed, so that mere mortals will never again strike terror. So we hear in that psalm some sense of helplessness a little bit, certainly sense of pain, wondering where is God, but also affirmations of faith that God will be there. And my guess is we all have known times like that. We can look on a global scale and we could read this psalm while watching the news and see it sometimes does feel like it is those who are wicked and yet are in power who succeed and prosper, whether it's political power or economic power or whatever, and they seem to not care anything about anybody else except what they can do to gain from them, to take from them, and the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, as we say, and we see that happen on a global scale, and we ask ourselves, God, why do you stand so far off? Why don't you do something about those situations? Now, we also can see it on a much more personal scale as well. You may have had a boss or a rival or a coworker, even a family member who abuses you in one way or another, who uses their power that they have against you for their gain and for your loss. And in my experience, both personal and in helping people, workplace pain can be some of the most just devastating pain. The very definition of stress is when we don't have control over a situation. And when you have a boss or a corporation or whatever, a ruling board, whatever it might be, that is putting down rulings from on high and placing heavy burdens on you, and you don't have any control over it, it can be so very, very painful. And there aren't a lot of options. You don't have a lot of control. You can quit. But if you quit, you might find it difficult to support your family. You can resist, but if you resist, you might get fired and again have difficulty supporting your family or whatever. And so that can be so very, very painful. Family pain is even more painful. When a family that is at once harmonious, something happens, everything falls apart, and particularly when one member perhaps refuses to enter into any kind of reconciliation or whatever, it is so very painful and it's out of your control, and it feels like we want to ask, why, God, don't you come and intervene in this family argument or problem, in this argument I have in my workplace or in a bigger argument in the wider world. Well, the Psalms of disorientation, and that is what Psalm 10 is, that's what Brueggemann would call it, they do assume that God cares and God acts. That's really important. There's this basic, a fundamental belief in God and an assumption in God, and there's always the voice and the complaint voiced to God. So they're not giving up on God, but there are also very hard questions asked of God. God, you're a God of justice, and you desire that the world be a place where there's peace on earth and goodwill toward all. So why aren't you acting? And it is incredibly painful because oftentimes, and we see it in this psalm several times, it talks about the helpless, the people who have absolutely no ability to do anything for themselves. They're so full of stress. God, why don't you do something else? So this is a psalm of trust, because it's constantly addressing God and assuring, the psalmist assuring themselves and even almost reminding God, you're a God of justice, you're a God who listens, you're a God who cares. But it's also obviously an impatient song. Why don't you do something? Why don't you do something now? Those first two lines, why do you stand so far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? If you are honest with yourself, it's quite likely that you can remember a time or maybe many times where it just seemed like God was absent and maybe even seemed almost as if God didn't care. Now, we sometimes fear that we can't complain or argue with God. You even hear that. Well, everything God does is fine. God never makes a mistake. We can't argue with God. That is not biblical at all. And it's certainly not the Psalms. We see the psalmist arguing with God. Why do you stand so far off? Aren't you a God of compassion and care? I know you listen and hear the helpless and the fatherless. So reach out and do something now in this particular situation. I have come to discover that when we complain to God, when we're honest with God about the way we're feeling, it is actually a doorway that opens us to greater trust and a greater relationship with God. My youngest sister, Lori, as you probably know, passed away this year from cancer, or this past year. And back in February, she wrote me a thank you note for a book that I had sent her. And part of this note demonstrates that she recognized that although she hated what was going on and she wanted a different resolution, she still trusted God anyway and it was making a difference. And so she wrote to me, I know this year has been has torn you apart also. You've been there for me, and I hate that cancer has come into our lives, but it hasn't destroyed us. We love God more and we love each other more, so the devil loses again. Wonderful sentiment that she offered there out of her complaining. I hate cancer. This year has torn us apart because of the cancer, and yet we've come to love God more and love each other more. She found that's almost a psalm of reorientation there. She found God's love in that instance, but it came by praying these psalms of disorientation. So let me read Psalms. I want to mention, continuing about her, one of the things that she hated that cancer did to her was it made her eventually resign from her job. And she was working with the wonderful ministry Family Promise that helps homeless families find a home and find jobs and get back on their feet. And many times these families have found themselves homeless through absolutely no fault of their own. A medical emergency that took all of their money, or some other catastrophe that happened that took all their money. Sometimes, of course, it was poor choices they made as well. But Lori's job was to help them get back on their feet. And she particularly worked on the financial side. She did a lot of financial counseling with people. And one of her big rivals, you might say, or adversaries, even enemies, was the predatory loan industry, the payday loans and this kind of things, because families would come to these people and these people would claim that they're going to help them, but what they really were doing was enslaving them and entrapping them, and they would take a relatively small loan out and have to pay it back many times over, and they basically were under the thumb of these people, and it sometimes drove them into homelessness, and Lori just hated that. The Psalm 10 verses 7 through 10 really pick up on that. I'm actually beginning with verse 2. In their arrogance, the wicked hunt down the weak, catching them in the schemes they devise. And then dropping down to verse 7. Their mouths are full of lies and threats. Trouble and evil are under their tongue. They lie in wait near the villages. Their eyes watch in secret for their victims. Like a lion in cover, they lie in wait. They lie in wait to catch the helpless, and drag them off in their nets. The innocent are crushed, they collapse, they fall victim to superior strength. And the wicked say to themselves, God will never notice. I think Lori felt that way about the predatory loan industry, and it does seem like they just prosper and survive on top of those people who can afford it least, and they prey on them as well. And so we have to pray, God, why don't you do anything? And Lori prayed about those things as well. But she also recognized that God was a God of care, and God is a God of justice. And again, as I mentioned, those prayers sometimes lead us into that. And that was what I think that letter that she wrote to me indicated as well. She had prayed the 10th Psalm, or prayers like that, argued with God, and that led her to trusting God. And that's where we do get verse 17. You, O Lord, hear the desire of the afflicted. You encourage them and you listen to their cry, defending the fatherless and the oppressed, so that mere earthly mortals will never again strike terror. That is a hope and a prayer for the far off, perhaps distant future when Christ comes again, but it's also a prayer for now, that God indeed will do something. Part of what I think these Psalms can remind us about is that when God doesn't do something, it isn't that God doesn't care, but sometimes God is holding back a little bit. Children often come to their parents demanding justice. He pushed me, he touched me, he said a bad thing about me, or whatever. And sometimes the parents intervene, but sometimes the parents choose not to intervene. And it isn't because they don't care, but they want to teach their children how to be able to get along, and they want to teach their children how to respond to injustice in their lives and respond in correct ways. And we too sometimes don't understand why God won't intervene now. And sometimes it may be because God is trying to teach us something or help us become who we need to become by standing on our own 2 feet. Helping us to mature. I don't think that's always the case, and sometimes it just feels like God isn't responding. In Scripture, the people of Israel were in Egypt for more than 400 years, and they initially come in and they are greeted and they are welcomed and they are honored, but then a Pharaoh comes who does not know Joseph, as the text says, and they are put into slavery. And we don't know how long that they were in slavery, but we know that Moses was born into slavery, and he doesn't come back to save his people because God says, I've heard my people's cry and I want to save them, until he's 80 years old. And so for more than 80 years, and maybe for hundreds of years, the people have been in slavery. They've been crying out, how long, O Lord? Why do you stand so far off? Why are you hiding from me in my time of distress? And when the time was right in God's eyes, when God knew it was time, God sends Moses. It's very interesting and I think important to note that when Moses took matters into his own hands and he strikes the Egyptian and kills him, that doesn't end the oppression. When we use evil techniques in order to try to get rid of evil, we just increase the evil. And what happens is Moses has to flee for his own life, but the oppression of his people continue. And so this is a reminder that has to be, oppression is countered in God's way, and God has to be a part of it in God's time. And we can't take up arms, so to speak, against the oppressors until we know that God is ready for us to do that as well. And so I think we are left rightly coming up with several conclusions from Psalm 10 and the other Psalms of disorientation. The first is that we are to challenge oppression. God challenges oppression. God is a God of justice. We are called to seek, to even challenge, even complain to God. We seek God, we complain to God, we challenge God. Why are you not doing anything? I think you should do something here. But we also trust that God is going to do something, that God is hearing, even when the answer doesn't come back the way that we would like it to. We trust that, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of the universe bends toward justice, but it's a long arc. And we trust that it is God, in fact, who is bending the arc of justice, the arc of the universe towards justice. And then we do trust that we are called to work for justice when we can. We don't simply sit back and say, well, it's too bad that those people are in trouble. It's too bad that this situation is going on. If we have it within our power to do something, then by all means, God is calling us to do it. But we do it in a godly way. And then finally, we're called to trust and love God, knowing that disorientation leads to reorientation always. And it's always a surprise. And I mentioned that earlier. And the most wonderful example of that, of course, is the cross. Jesus dies on the cross, the ultimate seeming triumph of the wicked, the triumph of injustice. God has been killed on the cross. God is gone. Good is gone. Evil will now reign forever and ever. And then in a surprise, and we can read those accounts and see just how surprised every one of Jesus' followers were on that Easter Sunday morning. Love arises from the tomb. God is raised from the dead and comes forth, and Jesus is only the first fruits of the resurrection. We are told we will participate in that as well. And the resurrection comes not only after we die and are resurrected, but God's in the resurrection business all along, but it always comes as a surprise. So whether you are currently in a time of disorientation where you're in a pit, or whether in 2025, sometime this year, you find yourself in that time, feel free to cry out to God. Feel free to let those cries help you increase your trust and love of God, and be waiting for, but know that you'll be surprised when God responds. And we do all of those things indeed because whether we can feel it or not, we know that God is with us. Amen.